Good evening, my dreaming souls. Tonight, we slip beyond the veils of time into deep jungles and older myths to uncover the enigma of one of the earliest and most mysterious civilizations of the Americas, the Olmecs. Long before the Maya, before the Aztecs carved their names in stone, the Olmecs walked these lands. They left behind little, but what they did leave speaks volumes. Colossal heads carved from basalt, staring silently through centuries. Depictions of jaguar gods, half beast, half man, and traces of a vanished world we're still trying to understand. Were they the first to write in the New World? The first to build cities in the rainforest? The answers are faint, half buried in soil and shadow. And as for what happened to them, that mystery still lingers in the stone. Before we begin, take a moment to like this video, subscribe for more journeys into the forgotten past, and tell us, where are you listening from tonight? Now, dim your lights, close your eyes, and let the soft rhythm of history carry you away. We are going deep into the jungles of ancient Mesoamerica to meet the stone-eyed ancestors, the Olmecs. Before towering pyramids rose in the jungles of the Yucatan, before Tenochtitlan shimmered on the lakes of the Valley of Mexico, and before the Maya etched their calendars into stone, there were the Olmecs. They left no epic conquests behind, no royal names echoed across centuries, and no great surviving cities swallowed by vines. What they did leave were shadows, symbols carved in basalt, faces staring with round eyes and thick lips, heads the size of cars, gazing out over empty plazas. The Olmecs are often called the mother culture of Mesoamerica, but they left no children to speak for them. There are no first-hand texts, no oral legends that reach back to them unbroken. What remains are fragments, a few cities, a trail of stones, artifacts scattered from riverbanks to ridges, and a mystery that deepens the closer you look. Their world began in the swamps and rainforests along the Gulf Coast, in what is now southern Veracruz and Tabasco. Dense, humid land, fed by winding rivers, pulsing with the life of jaguars, monkeys, and crocodiles. It is a place where the earth sweats and breathes, and where time seems to coil like a serpent rather than march forward. It was here nearly 3,500 years ago that something stirred. Villages grew, stonework began. Ceremonial centers emerged not from conquest, but from some quiet compulsion to shape the world. San Lorenzo, that was their first great center. By the time the Egyptians were building their new kingdom temples, the Olmecs were carving terraces into hillsides and arranging mounds around wide courtyards. San Lorenzo did not rise in dramatic pyramids, but in careful balance. It was a sacred geography, planned with intention. But what kind of intention, we can only guess. What struck the early archaeologists most was the scale. Massive basalt heads, each weighing several tons, hauled from distant quarries and shaped with obsidian tools. They were not broken into pieces or buried hastily. They were displayed, centered, and then, sometimes, they were deliberately buried again, hidden, as if someone wanted them to be seen and then forgotten. These heads, 17 found so far, are not portraits in the way a statue of a king might be. They are stylized, yet deeply personal. Broad faces, flattened noses, helmets or headdresses. Eyes that seem to watch you even when the jungle moves behind them. Were they rulers, gods, ancestors, warriors? No one knows for certain. Their expressions are calm, almost weary, as if they have seen something long ago that the rest of us have forgotten. San Lorenzo flourished for centuries, but then, suddenly, it declined. Buildings were abandoned, sculptures were defaced or buried. The population moved, but to where and why? No records exist to explain the fall. No invading army, no plague or fire, just silence and the slow reclaiming of stone by vine and rain. Then came La Venta. Built farther inland, La Venta rose as San Lorenzo faded, as if the spirit of the culture had shifted, not died. La Venta was grander, more mysterious. It featured a massive earthen pyramid, the first in Mesoamerica, not made of stone, but of layered clay, shaped into a ceremonial mountain. Nearby stood altars, stelae, and those same wide-eyed heads, watching, always watching. La Venta was not just a city. It was a sacred center, aligned with stars, marked by symbols, guarded by jaguar-faced deities carved into stone. Offerings were buried in layers serpentine figures, polished jade, mosaics that served no practical function. They were not made to impress the living. They were offerings to something else, something unseen. The Olmecs were not builders of empires. They left behind no walls or armies, but they were architects of meaning. Their art is rich with symbols that repeat across hundreds of miles and centuries of time: the downturned mouth of the jaguar, the cleft in the forehead, the infant with almond eyes and feline features. Something about their world mixed human with beast, earth with sky, life with death. Shamans appear in their iconography often half-transformed, crouched, or floating, caught between states of being. And then there is the writing. If it is writing, carved symbols found on stones and clay, some arranged in patterns that resemble the earliest known scripts in the Americas, but they remain undeciphered. A handful of signs, no Rosetta Stone to guide us. Are they names, prayers, instructions? If they were the first to write in the New World, the message was lost before it could be passed on. What we do know is this: Olmec influence spread far beyond their homelands. Their symbols appear in distant valleys, on the walls of later cities, in the myths of peoples who came centuries later. The Maya, the Zapotecs, even the Aztecs all show echoes of Olmec thought, Olmec forms. It is as if they left fingerprints on the mind of Mesoamerica, not rules but dreams. And then they vanished. Not overnight, but over centuries. By the time Rome was growing on the banks of the Tiber, the Olmecs had already receded into mystery. La Venta was abandoned. Tres Zapotes, their last known major site, persisted for a while longer, but the culture had changed. The monuments were no longer made in the old style. The art lost its depth. Something had passed. A dream had ended. What caused the fall? Environmental change? Internal strife? Religious shifts? Or was it simply the way all great cultures end not with fire, but with forgetting? The jungle swallowed their cities. Their language was lost. Their names were never written down. What we are left with are stones and questions. And questions, perhaps, are what the Olmecs intended us to have. Because when you stand before one of their colossal heads, when you feel the weight of those carved eyes pressing into your skin, you sense that you are not just looking at a relic, you are being looked at, measured, judged, and maybe, just maybe, invited to remember something you never knew you forgot. In the next part, we will follow the rise of San Lorenzo in greater detail, how the Olmecs moved stone across mountains, how they built their sacred landscapes, and how they shaped their world not for power, but for meaning. Because to understand the mystery of the Olmecs, we must begin where they began, at the rivers, in the clay, beneath the gaze of their silent gods. Long before the Maya raised stone cities from jungle floors, long before the Aztecs stood beneath the shadow of their great temples, there was San Lorenzo. In a world of tangled vines and humid river valleys, San Lorenzo rose like a deliberate dream, not a city in the modern sense, but something quieter, more symbolic. It was a place where people gathered, where stone was shaped, where space itself was carved into patterns that reflected something deeper than daily life. This was not simply architecture. It was storytelling in clay and basalt. San Lorenzo emerged along the Coatzacoalcos River, a winding lifeline that carried water, trade, and spirit through the tropical lowlands of what is now southern Veracruz. The land there is rich and green, but it is not forgiving. It floods, it shifts, it resists easy settlement. Yet the Olmecs chose it not the easiest place, but the right one. They saw the curves of the river, the hills rising just enough to feel like sacred ground, the way water and earth met like breath and body. It began with mounds, low at first, then higher, shaped carefully to form platforms and terraces. These mounds were not thrown together. They were leveled, layered, measured. Over time, the site expanded. Earthen ridges and causeways defined the space. Courtyards opened beneath the sky. Canals were cut into the ground, guiding water not just for crops, but possibly for ritual flowing in ways that matched the shape of thought. At its peak, San Lorenzo was the most sophisticated site in Mesoamerica. It was not the largest, but it was the most intentional. Every structure seemed to serve a purpose beyond the physical. Homes were built atop raised platforms, some small, some larger, perhaps reserved for elites or ritual leaders. But the most stunning features were the sculptures, not only the colossal heads, but also altars, thrones, and curious figures carved from solid stone. The sheer effort it took to create these pieces remains staggering. The basalt used for the heads and altars came from the Tuxtla Mountains, dozens of miles away. Imagine moving a boulder that weighed more than 10 tons through jungle paths, across rivers, without the wheel, without draft animals. They likely used rafts, log rollers, and coordinated teams working for weeks. And they did this not once, but over and over again. Why? Why spend so much time and effort on stone faces? Each colossal head is different. The features are distinct. The expressions are subtle. Some researchers believe they are portraits of rulers, commemorated like Roman busts. Others see them as mythic figures, representations of divine power or ancestral spirits. The helmets they wear might be signs of battle or of sport or of ritual. We do not know. But they were placed with care, facing outward as if to watch and guard the spaces in which they stood. Other carvings show human figures emerging from caves or mouths, sometimes framed by jaguar jaws. These are not everyday scenes. They are myths frozen in stone. The Olmecs believed in transformations, humans becoming beasts, beasts becoming symbols. The jaguar in particular appears again and again, sometimes alone, sometimes fused with human features. It was not just an animal. It was a force, a god, a mystery with claws. Beneath San Lorenzo, archaeologists have found buried offerings, caches of jade, serpentine, polished mirrors, and figurines. These were placed not for display, but for the earth. As if the Olmecs were feeding the land, or speaking to it in a language made of objects and silence. These deposits were layered carefully, sometimes beneath floors or altars. They speak of ceremony, of repetition, of belief so strong it left no need for explanation. And still, we do not know the names of the people who lived there. We do not know the sounds of their language. The script they left behind, if it is a script, remains undeciphered. A few symbols carved into stone blocks suggest the beginning of writing. They repeat in patterns. They seem to have direction, but without more, we are left to guess. Were these words? Numbers? Names? We may never know. What we do know is that San Lorenzo stood for centuries. It grew, changed, and eventually declined. Around 1,000 years before the birth of Christ, something shifted. The monuments were defaced or buried. Some colossal heads were moved from their original positions. Others were damaged, not by time, but by intention. Someone wanted to change the story. Theories abound. Perhaps there was an uprising, a shift in leadership, a religious transformation. Perhaps the river changed course, flooding the low-lying areas, forcing the people to move. Or perhaps it was something more elusive, a change in belief, a feeling that the sacred place no longer held power, and that it was time to begin again elsewhere. Whatever the reason, the people left. They did not vanish. They moved. They carried their symbols and their memories inland to La Venta and beyond. But San Lorenzo remained. The earth covered it slowly. The jungle crept in, and the heads, half buried, continued to watch. When modern archaeologists began uncovering the site in the 20th century, they found more than ruins. They found intention, order. A sense that the people who built San Lorenzo were not just constructing homes or gathering spaces, but mirrors of something larger. The layout of the city reflects a worldview one that linked land with sky, people with spirits, stone with story. It is tempting to romanticize the Olmecs, to imagine them as a peaceful, wise people untouched by war or ambition. But that would be unfair. Their art shows warriors. Their monuments show power. They were human. They ruled. They worshipped. They built. But they did something more. They dreamed in stone. They left behind not an empire, but a question. Who were they, really? What did they see in the world that made them shape it this way? And why, when they left, did they bury their gods face down in the earth? In the next part, we will travel with the culture as it shifts to La Venta, where the Olmecs reach new heights of symbolic complexity, where the earth itself is reshaped into pyramids and plazas, and where their most haunting offerings are buried beneath mosaics of green stone, because San Lorenzo was only the beginning, and what came next would blur the line between myth and memory even further. When San Lorenzo faded into silence, it did not take the Olmecs with it. The people, the beliefs, the spirit of the culture, all of it moved like a tide changing direction. Not to the north or the coast, but eastward, deeper into the lowlands, to a rise of land near the Tonala River. There, in the thick, fertile wetland, they built something new. It was not just a settlement. It was a vision. They called it La Venta. La Venta did not rise suddenly. It grew over generations, shaped by hands that remembered San Lorenzo but wanted something different. The new site was more symbolic, more aligned with ritual and cosmology. It was not a city in the way we think of cities. It was more like a sacred map laid upon the earth, a place where time folded inward and the land was shaped to match the heavens. At the heart of La Venta stood a massive clay mound rising over 100 feet above the ground. This was not a mound of rubble, it was engineered. Layer upon layer of colored clay, packed and shaped, until it formed a steep conical pyramid. This was the first major pyramid in Mesoamerica, and it was not meant for living in. It was meant for looking up at, or perhaps looking down from. Around the pyramid stretched plazas, platforms, and a ceremonial core laid out along a north to south axis. This orientation was not random. It echoed something celestial, something sacred. The sun, the stars, the flow of water, all were part of the plan. This was not just engineering. It was belief in the shape of the world. La Venta was filled with monuments. More colossal heads, carved from the same dark basalt, had been transported again from the distant Tuxtla Mountains. These heads stood in solemn lines, facing outward, still wearing their mysterious helmets, still holding their gaze. But there was more than just the familiar. New kinds of stonework appeared. Altars shaped like thrones, stelae carved with human figures, some kneeling, some emerging from symbolic mouths. The art of La Venta was more refined, more fluid, and more surreal. Many of these altars depicted a central figure, a man or deity seated within what looks like a cave or a mouth, sometimes framed by serpent jaws or surrounded by swirling lines that might be smoke or spirit. These images were not portraits. They were myths in stone, stories about the creation of the world, about emergence, transformation, sacrifice. They were not meant to be understood in one glance. They were meant to be felt. Beneath the surface of La Venta, the mystery deepens. Archaeologists found massive offerings buried beneath plazas. Not a few artifacts scattered by time, but carefully constructed deposits laid with ceremony. In one case, more than 600 pieces of polished serpentine were arranged in a mosaic pattern, a cross, or perhaps an abstract symbol, and then covered in clay. No one would see it again. It was not made for the eye. It was made for the earth. Other offerings included rows of jade and greenstone celts, shaped like axe blades, placed upright in radiating lines. Figurines were buried in scenes that suggest ritual or gathering tiny humans made of stone, arranged as if frozen mid-ceremony. One scene includes a central figure standing before a group of others. Was it a leader? A god? A priest? Again, the answer is just out of reach. This focus on hidden offerings says something important about the Olmec worldview. Their rituals were not about spectacle. They were about interaction with unseen forces. The gods or spirits they served did not demand display. They demanded depth, repetition, and secrecy. Power was not something you wore. It was something you placed carefully into the earth and walked away from. And yet La Venta was not cut off from the world. Far from it. The Olmecs traded widely. Their style, known now as Olmecoid, spread across the Gulf lowlands and into distant valleys. Symbols, motifs, even whole sculptures have been found far from La Venta, in places the Olmecs may never have ruled but clearly influenced. People copied their art. They adopted their forms. The Olmec jaguar god, the infant face with downturned mouth, the cleft forehead, these symbols echoed for centuries after La Venta was gone. This spread was not just cultural, it was spiritual. The Olmecs offered something that resonated with other peoples, a way of seeing the world not just as a place of survival, but as a place of meaning. Every hill was a mountain, every river a vein of power. Every day was a story in motion. The people of Laventa also seemed deeply interested in transformation. Their figures often show humans merging with animals. The most common of these hybrids was the jaguar. The jaguar was not just a predator. It was the embodiment of the unknown. It hunted by night. It moved between worlds, land and water, life and death. Olmec art shows humans with jaguar mouths, with feline claws, with intense, half-closed eyes. These were not costumes. These were states of being. Shamans likely held high status at Laventa, not just because they could heal or guide, but because they could cross thresholds between life and spirit, between man and beast, between worlds. The altars and sculptures reflect this obsession with liminality, with being on the edge of something vast and unseen. Despite its grandeur, Laventa too would eventually decline. By around 400 years before the birth of Christ, the ceremonial center was abandoned. The pyramid was left to the rain. The altars stood alone. Jungle crept in. No one knows why it ended. No invasion, no clear disaster, just time and change and the closing of a chapter. The Olmecs did not disappear, but their center shifted again. Later, cultures rose. The Maya built cities of stone and time. The Zapotecs carved tombs in the hills. The Teotihuacanos raised their own pyramids on a massive scale. But in each of these, the echoes remain. A symbol, a way of placing a plaza, a god with jaguar eyes. The legacy of Laventa is not in what we know. It is in what we feel when we stand before one of its buried offerings, or one of its wide-eyed heads, and realize that someone long ago believed so deeply in the world they saw that they carved their story into earth and stone, even knowing it might one day be forgotten. In the next part, we will explore the belief system that shaped the Olmec worldview, their gods, their rituals, their fascination with transformation and duality, and the eerie, dreamlike way they bridged the realms of the living and the dead. Because to understand why the Olmecs built the way they did, we must begin to understand what they believed was waiting beneath the surface. To understand how the Olmecs lived, you have to understand how they saw, not just with the eyes, but with the soul. Their world was not divided into simple categories of earth and sky, man and beast, day and night. It was layered, shifting, alive. Everything breathed. The hills, the rivers, the wind, even the stones. In the Olmec mind, reality was not flat. It was curved, coiled like a serpent, folded like cloth. And at the heart of that folded world was transformation. Olmec belief was not preserved in books or scrolls. There were no hymns carved in stone, no surviving codices. What we have are their carvings, their figurines, their sacred arrangements of clay and jade buried beneath the plazas of places like Laventa and San Lorenzo. We read their stories not in words, but in shapes. And the most powerful shape in their universe was the jaguar. The jaguar was not just an animal, it was a force. It ruled the night, prowled the forests, crossed rivers like a spirit in the mist. The Olmecs seemed to believe the jaguar was both protector and destroyer, mother and warrior, god and ancestor. In many of their carvings, human figures are shown with feline features, almond eyes, broad noses, curled lips. These were not masks. These were transformations. People becoming jaguars, jaguars becoming people. One of the most enduring figures in Olmec art is the so-called were-jaguar part human, part beast, always in transition. Sometimes it is a child with a jaguar mouth. Sometimes it is a grown man with slitted eyes and fangs. These figures do not shout or rage. They stare, they sit, they wait. They carry something in their silence that feels older than words. A secret maybe, or a warning. Many scholars believe these hybrid beings represent shaman spiritual leaders who could move between the human world and the spirit world, often through trance, fasting, or the use of hallucinogenic plants. These journeys were not metaphorical. The Olmecs believed they were real, that a trained and chosen person could enter the underworld, speak to gods, return with knowledge. It was not about faith, it was about access. And the underworld, to the Olmecs, was not hell. It was not punishment. It was a place of depth, of fertility, of mystery. It lay beneath the surface of things, under the ground, under the skin, under the breath. Caves for the Olmecs were sacred because they were openings to this realm. In their art, figures often emerge from mouths or portals. These are not births. They are crossings. The living world and the spirit world were connected by thresholds, and the Olmecs knew how to find them. Their gods, if that is the right word, were not always personified. Some were forces. The rain god, for example, appears not as a gentle farmer, but as a fierce, infant-like figure with flame eyebrows and snarling lips. He was the storm, the flood, the giver, and the taker. Another recurring figure is the maize god, often shown with a corn sprout rising from his head. He is young, almost delicate, but he holds power because he is life itself. Corn, after all, was not just food, it was identity. To grow corn was to shape the future, to feed your children, your gods, your dead. The maize plant rising from the soil mirrored the sun rising from the underworld each day. Every harvest was a resurrection, and every loss a death. The Olmecs built their calendar around it. Their ceremonies revolved around it. It was a god you could hold in your hand. This sense of balance runs through everything the Olmecs created, not just balance between man and God, but between opposing forces night and day, life and death, wet and dry, order and chaos. They saw the world as a tension that had to be maintained, not resolved. Their art rarely shows conflict. It shows process, evolution, faces that shift from human to divine and back again. Offerings were a key part of maintaining this balance, not just the dramatic burials of jade and figurines beneath the plazas, but smaller acts too. Items placed at doorways, arrangements of bones or shells. Fire burned in specific patterns. These acts were not decorative. They were part of the contract between people and the forces that move through the world. You give something, you take something. You speak to the earth, and you listen for its reply. Death, too, was not the end. Very few Olmec tombs have been found, but those that exist are rich in symbolism. The dead were often buried with masks, as if to protect or transform them in the next world. In one site, a burial was found with a jade jaguar curled beside the body. Was it a guardian, a companion, a symbol of the transformation to come? The Olmecs did not believe the soul stopped. It moved, changed, returned, like the river, like the moon. And the moon, it should be said, was part of this dance as well. Celestial bodies mattered deeply to the Olmecs. Their ceremonial centers were often aligned with solstices or lunar phases. The night sky was a map of the spirit world, and every shift in light was a message. They tracked Venus, the sun, the constellations, not for navigation, but for insight. The heavens were not far away. They were above and within. The gods were not distant. They were everywhere. This belief system, intuitive, symbolic, ever-transforming, gave the Olmecs a sense of place in the universe that went beyond territory or conquest. They did not need to build empires. They built meaning. They did not write laws. They wrote stories in stone, stories that still murmur under moss and mud, waiting to be read. And even though we cannot read their script, we feel their presence in the altars, in the figurines, in the strange calm of their carved eyes. They were not trying to be remembered. They were trying to speak to something older than memory. In the next part, we will turn our gaze to the artistry of the Olmecs, not just the massive heads and altars, but the intricate small works, the jade carvings, the objects that passed from hand to hand like prayers in solid form. Because to understand how the Olmecs believed, we must look at how they created not for fame, but for something sacred, something eternal. Art was not decoration for the Olmecs. It was communication. It was ceremony. It was a way to shape reality into form, to express the unseen, to speak to gods who had no mouths. The artists of San Lorenzo, La Venta, and beyond did not carve and polish to impress one another. They did it to honor, to channel, to connect. Their creations were not merely beautiful. They were powerful. They were alive in the way sacred things are always alive. When most people think of Olmec art, their minds jump first to the colossal heads, those basalt monuments with heavy brows and deep-set eyes. They are impressive, even intimidating. But they are only one part of a much richer story. For every giant head planted in a plaza, there were dozens, maybe hundreds, of smaller objects carved, shaped, and buried with deliberate hands. These were not leftovers. These were central to their world. Jade was one of the Olmecs' favorite materials. Not because it was the easiest to work with, it was not, but because it was the hardest to fake. Jade is dense, tough, and takes time to shape, and it lasts. It holds the polish of touch for thousands of years. The Olmecs sourced jade from far-off places, carrying it down rivers, across mountains, through steamy forests. To them, it was not just a gem. It was sacred. Some of the most delicate Olmec jade works are celts shaped like axe blades, flat, tapered at the bottom, smooth and symmetrical. Many were not used for cutting. They were ritual objects. Polished to a mirror-like finish, some were buried in rows or in patterns that suggest meaning far beyond function. In a famous offering from La Venta, more than a dozen celts were found upright, arranged like rays of green light spreading across the clay. Not for war, for the earth, for the gods. Other jade pieces were carved into human faces, often small enough to fit in the palm of a hand. These faces were idealized, serene, sometimes feline. They echoed the features seen in larger monuments: broad noses, full lips, almond-shaped eyes. Some have holes, suggesting they were worn. Others were found alone, as if offered like prayers. Many have the cleft forehead that reappears across Olmec art, a symbol whose meaning we have not decoded, but whose presence we cannot ignore. Figurines, too, were part of Olmec expression. They carved humans and gods, sometimes mixing the two. The materials varied: jade, serpentine, clay, even volcanic rock. The figures stood upright, arms at their sides or crossed over their chests. Some were infants, others adults. Some had gaping mouths, as if singing or calling. A few show signs of having been broken on purpose, then buried. Not discarded, but released. These were not toys. These were vessels. The artistry of the Olmecs extended to masks, though none have been found in tombs worn by the dead. These were not funerary in the way later Mesoamerican cultures used masks. Instead, they may have been ritual objects worn or held during ceremonies. Some masks were made of greenstone and shaped to fit the face. Others were symbolic, depicting snarling jaguar mouths or the smooth faces of maize gods. The details are precise. The polish is deep. You can imagine them catching the firelight in a darkened temple, eyes staring through eyes. Beyond stone, the Olmecs also worked with clay. Their pottery, though simpler in style than their carvings, shows care and continuity. Bowls, plates, and effigy vessels shaped like animals or humans have been found in domestic settings and ceremonial sites alike. Some pieces are painted, others incised. They tell smaller stories of food, of fire, of hands passing knowledge from mother to daughter, priest to apprentice. Olmec artisans likely lived close to the centers of power. Their work was not private or hidden away. It was woven into the life of the community. Sculptures stood in public spaces. Altars were approached by all. Offerings were buried not by kings but by groups, by families, by the collective. Art was not owned. It was shared. It was witnessed. And then, often, it was hidden again. This act of burial appears over and over in Olmec sites. Entire caches of art, arranged carefully, then sealed beneath layers of clay and soil. It was not disposal. It was offering. The effort involved tells us everything. You do not carry dozens of jade figurines across miles and bury them in a perfect square unless you believe it matters. Unless you are speaking to something you trust, will listen, even from below. The way Olmec art plays with symmetry and balance also speaks to their worldview. Many sculptures are paired, mirrored, or arranged along specific axes. Duality was important. Not just light and dark, but male and female, dry and wet, birth and death. Their gods were not solitary. They existed in cycles and pairs. The art reflects this harmony without stillness. Motion captured at a moment of perfect balance. And there is always the sense of transformation. One figure, found carved in greenstone, shows a human crouched, his face mid-change into a feline snarl. Another shows an infant with both human and animal features, wrapped in the coils of a stylized serpent. These are not just strange hybrids. They are keys to a different logic, a way of seeing the self as fluid, as part of a larger spiritual ecology. Even the colossal heads, though grand and formal, carry this sense of dual meaning. They may depict rulers or warriors, but they also suggest gods or ancestors or something we cannot name. Their expressions are calm but not dull. They hold a kind of weary wisdom, as if they have watched the world change 100 times and know it will change again. The Olmec artist, whoever he or she was, did not sign their work. There are no names, no studios, no legacies carved into pedestals. The work was enough. The offering was complete, when the shape matched the meaning, when the stone felt true, when the object could carry the weight of the unseen. And then it was buried, or displayed, or handed down until it too found rest. In the next part, we will move beyond the heartlands following the reach of Olmec influence into distant regions, exploring how their symbols, styles, and sacred forms traveled across Mesoamerica leaving a trail of echoes. Because the Olmecs were not only artists and builders, they were messengers, and their message did not stop at the edge of their own rivers. It kept moving, carried by hands and memory into a wider world. The Olmecs did not build a traditional empire. They had no known armies, no written laws, no governors posted in far-off provinces. They were not interested in ruling land through fear or conquest. And yet, their influence spread. Far beyond the swamps and river valleys of their homeland, Olmec ideas traveled across Mesoamerica. Their symbols, their art, their vision of the sacred world moved from village to village, across highlands and lowlands, taking root in places they may never have seen with their own eyes. This spread of culture was not accidental. It was carried by trade, by pilgrimage, by shared rituals and shared questions. Archaeological evidence shows that goods flowed outward from San Lorenzo and La Venta, not just everyday tools, but prestige items, jade figurines, carved celts, pottery with distinctive Olmec designs. These objects were not tossed into the market like ordinary goods. They were treasured, buried in sacred places, treated with respect. At sites hundreds of miles from the Olmec core, across what is now central and southern Mexico, remnants of their visual language appear, stylized jaguar faces, infant gods with curled lips and closed eyes, stone thrones carved with a familiar cave-mouth motif. These were not simple copies. They were echoes adapted, reshaped by local hands into something new but still recognizably Olmec. One of the most striking examples of this diffusion is found in the valley of Oaxaca, where the Zapotec civilization later rose. Before Monte Alban was built on its mountaintop, before the Zapotecs carved their own tombs and calendars, the early peoples of the region were already in contact with Olmec traders or emissaries. At the site of San Jose Mogote, a carved stone slab known as Monument 3 shows a figure lying on his back, blood flowing from his chest, his name glyph floating above him. The style is distinctly Olmec, but the message is local. This was one of the earliest known depictions of ritual sacrifice in the region, and it tells us that Olmec beliefs were being translated into new cultural contexts. The same is true in the highlands of Chiapas and Guatemala, where early Maya settlements show Olmec-style carvings and motifs. The Maya, who would later develop their own complex writing and calendar systems, seem to have inherited parts of their religious framework from the Olmecs. The maize god, so central to Maya belief, first appears in Olmec art. The sacred mountain, the world tree, the tripartite universe, these are ideas with deep roots, and many of those roots begin in the Olmec worldview. Even in distant regions like Guerrero, high in the mountains, Olmec-style figurines and masks have been found. These are not cheap knockoffs. They are made with care, with local materials but familiar forms. It is as if communities across the land were tuning in to a signal from the Gulf Coast, interpreting it in their own way, adding their own voice to a growing chorus. This spread of symbols did not happen overnight. It took centuries. It was not just about trade or travel, it was about meaning. The Olmec vision offered something powerful, a way to understand the world that went beyond immediate survival. They spoke of transformation, of balance, of hidden forces that moved beneath the surface of life. These ideas resonated with other cultures, who found in them a mirror of their own experiences. We do not know what the Olmecs called themselves. The name we use comes from the Aztecs, who lived more than 2,000 years later and spoke of the people of the rubber land. They knew something had come before them, something ancient and powerful. And so did the Maya, who preserved stories of an earlier age, a time when the gods walked the earth and taught humans how to live. In the codices of the Maya, in the myths carved on their temples, there are shadows of Olmec thought, stories of twins descending into the underworld, of maize gods dying and being reborn, of sacred bundles carried through the jungle, wrapped in meaning too deep for words. The Olmec past was not just history. It became legend. It shaped the mythic memory of Mesoamerica. This legacy can also be seen in architecture. The layout of ceremonial centers, plazas aligned with celestial events, pyramids representing sacred mountains, ball courts echoing cosmic battles, all have their beginnings in Olmec centers like La Venta. Later cultures refined and expanded these forms, but the foundation was already there, a blueprint written not in blue ink but in clay, in stone, in intention. Even the Mesoamerican ball game, played with rubber balls on stone courts, may have Olmec origins. While definitive proof is hard to find, early ball game-related artifacts have been uncovered near Olmec sites. The game was more than sport. It was a ritual, a cosmic drama played out on Earth. Life and death, order and chaos, sun and shadow. These were the stakes. And the Olmecs, it seems, were the first to shape the field. All of this points to a civilization that mattered not because it ruled, but because it resonated. The Olmecs did not march across the land with armies. They moved through symbols, through beliefs, through the slow, steady pull of meaning. And those meanings took root in the hands of potters, in the visions of shamans, in the carvings of later kings who never knew the name of San Lorenzo but felt its weight in their bones. The Olmecs were not forgotten, not really. Their faces remained, carved in stone. Their gods evolved, but did not disappear. Their way of seeing, the jaguar eye that sees both day and night, became part of the spiritual DNA of a whole region. In the next part, we will return to the heartland to examine how the Olmec civilization began to fade, how La Venta was eventually abandoned, and how the quiet disappearance of their cities left behind more questions than answers. Because even as their symbols spread far and wide, something shifted at home. And the people who once carved gods into greenstone and spoke through clay began to fall silent. For hundreds of years, the Olmecs carved their gods into stone, shaped their beliefs into plazas and pyramids, and buried their offerings in carefully arranged layers of earth. From the swampy lowlands of San Lorenzo to the sacred mounds of La Venta, they built more than cities. They built a language of silence, of shapes, of sacred weight. But even the most deeply rooted trees will one day fall. The Olmec world did not end in fire or conquest. It ended in silence. By around 400 years before the birth of Christ, the great ceremonial center of La Venta was abandoned. The pyramid stood alone. The altars, once touched by ritual hands, were left to the elements. No army came. No empire marched in. There was no final battle, no invasion carved into the walls. There was only a slow and quiet departure, a culture folding inward, a song sung to the end. What caused the fall of the Olmec centers is still a matter of debate. There are no written records to guide us, no chronicles passed down through time. We are left with patterns in the soil, with broken sculptures, with shifting riverbeds and buried mosaics. and from these a few possibilities begin to take shape. One is the environment. The Olmec heartland was always rich, but also volatile. Rivers changed course. Swamps expanded and contracted. Seasonal floods could turn farmland into wetlands. If the balance between water and land tipped too far in one direction, it could have made their ceremonial sites difficult to maintain. Crops might have failed. Communities might have moved inland, away from the unreliable ground. There is also the question of leadership. The Olmec world seems to have been ruled not by kings in the later Mesoamerican sense, but by ritual elites, shamans, priests, figures who could move between the human world and the spirit world. If their power was questioned, or if new beliefs rose in their place, the community might have shifted its center. A change in ritual can lead to a change in place. Some archaeologists suggest internal conflict. Signs of defacement have been found at San Lorenzo, monuments broken or buried intentionally. Was it a rebellion? A rejection of the old order? A new generation rising with different ideas? Or was it ritual closure, a way to end a cycle with dignity, to return the sacred objects to the earth before moving on? The truth may lie somewhere between these ideas. A combination of environmental stress, social transformation, and shifting beliefs. The Olmecs may not have collapsed in the way later empires did. They may have simply changed form. Their centers emptied, their ceremonies ceased, their artists laid down their tools, but the people did not vanish. There is evidence that after the fall of La Venta, other sites in the region continued to be occupied. Smaller settlements, less monumental but still connected to the past. At Tres Zapotes, a site further west, Olmec-style art and writing continued for centuries. The colossal heads remained. The jaguar eyes still stared, but the energy had changed. The old fire had cooled. Tres Zapotes is also where the long count calendar first appears. This is the system later perfected by the Maya, the calendar, that counts the days from a fixed mythical starting point in the distant past. The earliest known long count date, carved into a stone monument at Tres Zapotes, records a moment in time more than 2,000 years before today. It marks a transition, a thread between the Olmec past and the Mesoamerican future. But even at Tres Zapotes, the symbols grow quieter over time. The art becomes less expressive, more rigid. The fluid lines and transformative figures of early Olmec sculpture give way to more standard forms. The magic does not disappear, but it fades. The people still lived there. They still made offerings. But something had passed. It is tempting to speak of decline, of collapse. But perhaps that is not the right word. The Olmecs were not conquered. They were not erased. They were absorbed. Their ideas lived on in the cultures that followed. The Maya, the Zapotecs, the Teotihuacanos, and later the Mixtecs and Aztecs all carried pieces of the Olmec puzzle. Sometimes knowingly, sometimes not. And maybe that was always the point. The Olmecs did not build empires. They built meaning. They carved their questions into stone and left them buried for others to find. They trusted the earth to remember. They did not write their names. They did not build monuments to ego. They built mirrors, tools, symbols, things that could outlast a voice, a name, a dynasty. In the jungles of Tabasco, on the edges of forgotten plazas, fragments of those meanings still lie beneath the soil. A jade figure worn smooth by centuries of touch, a celt placed upright in a circle of others, a face neither human nor beast, staring up through the layers of time. These are not relics, they are sentences, pauses, half-finished prayers. The final years of the Olmec centers were likely quiet. Children playing in courtyards where ceremonies were once held, markets where altars once stood. The transition was not sudden. It was human, gradual, messy, beautiful in its own way. Cultures do not die in an instant. They shift, they move like rivers, changing shape, finding new paths. And as those rivers moved, so did the memory of the Olmecs, carried not in language, but in form, not in stories, but in symbols, their heads, their gods, their way of seeing. These did not vanish. They scattered like seeds. In the next part, we will follow those seeds. We will explore how the spirit of the Olmecs lived on in the cultures that followed not as imitation, but as inheritance. Because the Olmecs may have fallen silent, but their vision continued to speak, reshaped by new hands, reimagined in new cities, whispered into the stones of temples they never saw but somehow helped to build. The story of the Olmecs did not end with the quiet abandonment of La Venta or the weathering of colossal heads at Tres Zapotes. Though their cities emptied and their sculptures fell silent, something of the Olmec spirit remained. It moved forward not in armies or in books, but in symbols, in beliefs, in ways of seeing the world that took root deep in the soil of Mesoamerica. Their legacy did not vanish. It transformed, just like their jaguar gods. Long after the last Olmec ritual was performed beneath the shadow of a clay pyramid, new cities began to rise. First in the highlands of Oaxaca, then in the steamy forests of the Petén Basin, then in the high valleys near what would one day become Mexico City. These new cultures, built on foundations that were partly visible and partly buried, the Olmecs did not leave maps, but they left markers. And those markers were noticed. The Zapotecs of Oaxaca began building their first ceremonial center at Monte Alban around 500 years before the birth of Christ. The city rose on a flattened hilltop, its plazas and temples aligned with the cardinal directions, its layout designed not just for power, but for harmony. There are echoes of Olmec thought in the way the Zapotecs viewed their gods and ancestors. Their early sculptures show figures that resemble the Olmec-style almond eyes, full lips, and the strange, serene expressions that seem to belong to a world just beyond our own. The Maya, emerging a little later and farther east, took the Olmec fascination with time and transformation and expanded it into something even more elaborate. They created vast calendars, complex writing systems, and entire cities designed to mirror the cosmos. And at the heart of their belief system sat familiar figures: the maize god, reborn each year; the underworld, filled with challenges and spirits; the jaguar, still watching in the dark. The Maya were not Olmecs, and they did not pretend to be. They had their own language, their own history, their own vision. But the foundation had been laid long before, in the shapes of altars, in the symbolism of caves and mountains, in the belief that human life was connected to cycles of death, rebirth, and divine presence. In the central highlands of Mexico, another city began to rise, Teotihuacan. Its pyramids still dominate the landscape today, even after centuries of ruin. The Pyramid of the Sun, the Pyramid of the Moon, the Avenue of the Dead, all were constructed with precision and care, aligned to celestial events. There are no written records from the builders of Teotihuacan, no surviving names. But among the murals and sculptures, familiar forms appear: serpents with feathered bodies, deities with feline features, rituals that honor both the earth below and the sky above. Later still, the Toltecs and the Aztecs would carry these threads forward. The Aztecs in particular saw themselves as heirs to ancient knowledge. They told stories of earlier ages, of gods who created the world through sacrifice, of places where humans first emerged. Among those stories were faint memories of the Olmecs. The Aztecs believed in a people who came before, who knew the gods better than anyone, who could shape stone with magic and call the rain with ceremony. They did not know their names, but they knew their power. In Aztec mythology, the Olmecs became something like cultural ancestors, not just of blood, but of thought. They were the ones who started the long dialogue between people and gods. They were the first to understand the balance between creation and destruction, and they were the ones whose symbols remained, carved into the bones of the land. Even in places far from the Olmec heartland, the echoes persisted. In murals, in figurines, in the structure of myths passed down from one tongue to another, there was no single path. The Olmec legacy did not move in a straight line. It rippled, shifted, faded, and returned. Sometimes clear, sometimes barely visible, like a dream you wake from slowly. Modern archaeologists can trace some of these echoes with careful hands and careful guesses. They follow the patterns in pottery. They study the layout of temples. They compare symbols scratched into stone. But there is something that cannot be measured: a presence, a sense that beneath all the visible culture of Mesoamerica lies a foundation not just of stone, but of story. The Olmecs taught later peoples how to shape the sacred into the everyday, how to place a pyramid so it speaks to the stars, how to bury an offering so it feeds the earth, how to look at a jaguar and see not just an animal, but a mirror of the soul. These lessons were not written. They were carved, whispered, reenacted in rituals that outlasted the names of their original makers. Even today, in the festivals and traditions of indigenous communities in southern Mexico and Central America, you can find the old rhythms, not unchanged, but recognizable. The respect for maize, the understanding of balance, the belief that the land is alive and that to live well means to listen. In museums, Olmec sculptures sit behind glass. People walk past them, amazed by their age, their size, their silence. But these are not relics. They are remnants of a voice. They speak not of kings and wars, but of deeper things, of cycles, of memory, of the spaces between what is seen and what is felt. The Olmecs may never have known what would come after them. They carved their gods into basalt. They buried their stories in clay. They lived their lives according to the rhythms of the sky and the pulse of the jungle. And then, slowly, they stepped back. But the shapes they left behind became seeds, not just of architecture or art, but of identity, of belief, of the quiet knowledge that there is always more to the world than what can be touched. In the next part, we will return to the land itself, to the jungles, rivers, and mountains that shaped the Olmec world. Because to truly understand the people who began this ancient legacy, we must look not just at what they made, but at the place that made them. The environment was not just a setting for the Olmecs. It was a partner, a spirit, a voice, and it still speaks. To understand the Olmecs, you have to go back to the land, not to maps or ruins, but to the heat, the water, the deep green breath of the jungle. Their world was not dry stone and bare desert like that of Egypt. It was wet, alive, shifting. It was a world of rivers, mangroves, heavy rains, and soils so rich that trees seemed to grow overnight. The Olmecs lived where the land did not sit still, where the ground softened under your feet, where water and earth spoke in the same voice. The heartland of the Olmec world stretched along the Gulf Coast through what is now southern Veracruz and Tabasco. Even today, it is a place where the air hangs thick with moisture and the line between land and water often blurs. There are winding rivers that flood and recede with the seasons. There are low hills that rise just enough to stay dry during storms. And everywhere there is growth vines, palms, cebas, and the tangled underbrush that hides everything unless you already know where to look. This land was not an obstacle. It was a partner. The Olmecs learned early how to listen to it. They chose their sites with care, not on the highest ground, but on the right ground. Ground that could support their terraces, their mounds, their plazas. Ground near water, but not swallowed by it. Ground where the rhythms of flooding could be used, not fought. San Lorenzo, their first great center, sat on a ridge above the Coatzacoalcos River. That river was more than a source of water. It was a highway, a lifeline, a path through the thick green world. The Olmecs built canals to manage the flow, to drain parts of the site and irrigate others. They understood the seasonal rise and fall. They worked with it, not against it. Water did not divide their cities. It shaped them. The environment also shaped what they ate and how they lived. The Olmec diet was rich, varied, and carefully balanced. They grew maize, of course. It was their foundation, their sacred grain. But they also cultivated beans, squash, sweet potatoes, avocados, and chili peppers. They fished in the rivers, caught turtles and shellfish, hunted deer and peccary in the forests. And they gathered what the jungle offered: fruits, nuts, herbs, and honey. This was not a world of scarcity. It was a world of abundance, if you knew how to read it. Their homes were likely made of wood and thatch, light structures suited to the heat and humidity. None survive, but the patterns of post holes and the arrangement of platforms suggest clustered neighborhoods with families living close together, organized around courtyards. It was not the grandeur of the pyramids that made their cities breathe. It was the daily life carried out in the spaces between. The weather was not gentle. The Gulf Coast sees heavy rains for much of the year. Storms roll in from the ocean, sudden and loud. Lightning strikes the hills. The rivers rise and sometimes rage. But even in this, the Olmecs saw meaning. Rain was not a threat. It was a gift. The rain god they carved was not peaceful. He had flame brows and a jaguar's snarl. He brought water and also the flood. He could give and destroy. The balance had to be honored. Animals were everywhere, and they were more than creatures. They were signs. Jaguars, crocodiles, monkeys, snakes, birds. Each had a role in the Olmec imagination. The jaguar, with its silent step and golden eyes, became the central figure of their transformation mythos. The crocodile, ancient and armored, may have symbolized the earth itself. Monkeys appeared in figurines, playful and strange. Birds with curling crests sat on the heads of gods. To live among these animals was not just to share space, it was to share spirit. Even the mountains mattered. The Tuxtla Range to the north was their quarry and maybe their sacred origin. From its flanks came the basalt used for the colossal heads and thrones. These mountains were not tall, but they were dense, wet, and alive with mist. The Olmecs may have seen them as the place where gods lived or where ancestors walked. To carve stone from those slopes and bring it back to the flatlands was not just labor, it was ritual. The jungle itself was layered, not just in foliage, but in meaning. There was the world of the ground, where people lived and worked. The world above, in the trees and the sky, where birds flew and the sun moved. And the world below, under the soil, in the caves, in the water. That was the world of spirits and roots and memory. The Olmecs did not separate these layers. They lived among them all at once. This layered view of the world showed up in their city layouts. Plazas connected to water features, mounds rose like artificial mountains, temples aligned with solstices or river bends. Nothing was placed randomly. Everything spoke to something, to a star, to a god, to a story passed from one generation to the next. Their cities were not just places to live, they were maps of the sacred. And when the land shifted, when floods changed the river's path, or when the soil grew tired, the Olmecs moved. They did not cling to places out of stubbornness. They respected the signs. If the gods no longer favored a site, if the balance tipped, they began again. The jungle would swallow what was left. The rain would erase the paths. But something always remained. Even today, the environment of the Olmec heartland holds their spirit. In the soft rumble of a swollen river, in the call of a bird deep in the forest, in the curve of a hill where a platform once stood. The jungle does not forget. It covers, but it also protects. Modern researchers who work in these regions often speak of the difficulty and wonder of it. You do not simply walk through the jungle. You are allowed in. The heat slows you. The insects test you. The rain can arrive with no warning and soak the ground until it becomes a mirror of the sky. But then, in a clearing, you may find a stone, a head, a shard of jade, a whisper from a world long gone. The Olmecs built nothing to last forever, but they lived with the land in a way that still teaches. They took only what they needed. They gave back with offerings and care. They watched the signs. They listened. And in doing so, they created a way of life that shaped more than a culture. It shaped a memory, a rhythm, a kind of wisdom that still moves beneath the roots and rivers. In the final part of this story, we will gather what we have seen, the art, the gods, the cities, the land, and return to the beginning. To the question that still lingers whenever you stand before one of their stone heads or hold one of their jade figures in your hand. Who were they, really? And why, after all this time, do we still feel like they are watching? When a civilization disappears, it rarely vanishes all at once. Stones do not fall in perfect unison. Myths do not stop being whispered overnight. The last light is not always the smallest. Often it flickers for centuries, passed hand to hand like a quiet ember. That is the story of the Olmecs. Their cities emptied, their pyramids eroded. The colossal heads sank into the earth. But their spirit did not go dark. It sank, too, not into oblivion, but into memory, into the soil of Mesoamerica, into the eyes of jaguars painted on temple walls centuries later, into the myths of gods with human mouths and feline teeth. The Olmecs did not leave behind a chronicle. They left a presence, and that presence still lingers. We know only fragments, and perhaps that is exactly how the Olmecs would have wanted it. Their art does not shout, it hums. Their gods do not pose, they wait. Their cities are not monuments to ego, but maps of meaning built not to impress, but to align, to reflect, to bind the heavens and the underworld with clay and stone. What we do know has emerged slowly, like a figure walking out of fog. The colossal heads once dismissed as curiosities now stand as symbols of mastery and intent. The jade offerings buried beneath plazas speak not of riches, but of reverence. The figurines, with their wide, closed eyes, carry the weight of vision not outward, but inward. The Olmecs were not builders of empire, they were makers of meaning. When San Lorenzo fell silent and La Venta's pyramid watched the sky alone, the Olmecs were not gone. They had become something else. Their symbols traveled. Their worldview was inherited. The Maya looked to their maize god. The Zapotecs aligned their cities with stars. The Aztecs whispered stories of a people from before time, from the rubberlands, who shaped the world and vanished into mist. And now, centuries later, we find ourselves looking back, trying to see through their eyes, trying to read a language not made of letters, but of curves and stone and intention. We find ourselves staring into the faces they carved, wondering what they saw in us, or what they hoped we would one day understand. They lived close to the earth, but looked to the stars. They saw animals not as lesser beings, but as guides. They marked time not only with seasons, but with spirit. Life and death were not opposite ends. They were part of a cycle, a spiral, a return. Every offering was a conversation. Every sculpture was a prayer. And every site they built was a question shaped into form. What did they believe would happen when they left their offerings behind, when they buried their green stones and mirror-polished celts beneath the ground? Did they think the gods would notice? Did they think someone, a child, a priest, or even someone like us would someday uncover them and listen? Maybe they did not care about being remembered. Maybe they only cared about doing it right, living in rhythm, speaking to the world, watching the rivers rise and fall, and adjusting with them, listening to the forest, honoring the jaguar's path, marking the days with rituals that turned the ordinary into something sacred. That, perhaps, is the lesson the Olmecs offer us. Not a blueprint, not a command, but a way of looking, a way of being in the world that values balance, patience, and reverence. They did not rush, they did not conquer, they placed, they aligned, they gave. And because of that, their voice still echoes. In the stones that rise from the jungle floor, in the carvings found in forgotten fields, in the stories we tell now, wondering how a people with no writing we can read could say so much without speaking. They say time is a circle in many ancient traditions. The Olmecs likely believed this too, that what comes passes, and what passes comes again, that nothing truly ends, it transforms, it returns. The maize dies and returns, the jaguar sleeps and hunts again, the rain falls, dries, and falls once more. And so too does memory. The Olmecs may be gone, but the meaning they shaped remains. Archaeologists will continue to dig. More stones will be found, more symbols uncovered. Maybe someday someone will find the key to their script and unlock a voice that has been silent for thousands of years. Or maybe we already know what matters. Maybe the silence is part of the message. Maybe the Olmecs were teaching us to listen not with our ears, but with our attention. In a world where noise often drowns meaning, the Olmecs remind us of the power of stillness, of presence, of a slow hand carving a stone face not for glory, but for the god of rain or the spirit of the jaguar, or a child not yet born. That kind of patience, that kind of intention is rare, and it lasts. So we leave them here, not in finality, but in peace. Let them rest in their forest, in their river valleys, under their pyramids of clay. Let the rain continue to fall where it always has. Let the stones grow moss again. Let the jaguars walk. But let us remember, not because we owe them anything, but because they gave us something, a glimpse of another way to live, to believe, to shape the world, quietly, deeply, beautifully. And that is enough. Ancient Egypt, the rise of the Nile Kingdom. It began not with conquest or war, but with water. Before the pyramids, before the pharaohs, before names like Ramses or Cleopatra echoed across centuries, there was a river, the Nile, a ribbon of life stretching across a land of desert and stone. It flowed from deep in the heart of Africa, slow and steady, feeding the soil, carving the land, and shaping the people who would one day build a kingdom of eternity. In the earliest days, there were no cities, no crowns, no written names, only small communities that watched the river and learned to live with its moods. Each year, the waters rose in the summer and flooded the valley. The flood brought silt, rich and dark, perfect for growing food. Wheat, barley, vegetables, all of it pulled from the soil left behind by the Nile's generous overflow. People began to settle. They learned where to plant, when to harvest, how to shape canals and dikes to guide the river's strength. These early farmers did not build monuments. Their homes were simple, their tools were basic, but they understood something deep, that the river was not just water, it was time, it was order. It was the spine of their world. And slowly, over generations, those small riverside communities grew into something more. Villages became towns. Towns became regions. Each had its own leader, often a strongman or priest, someone who could speak for the gods and organize the people. Over time, two great regions formed Upper Egypt in the south, where the Nile ran narrow between cliffs, and Lower Egypt in the north, where the river fanned out into a rich green delta. These two lands were different in many ways, but the river tied them together, and eventually someone would do more than tie them. He would unite them. His name was Narmer. At least, that is the name historians have given him, based on ancient inscriptions found carved into stone. Some say he was the same man as Menes, the legendary king written about by later Egyptian scribes. Whoever he truly was, around 5,000 years ago, he accomplished something that would shape the entire future of Egypt. He brought the two lands together. With diplomacy, with warfare, with ceremony, he became the first king of a unified Egypt. Narmer's palette, a slab of stone carved with symbols and scenes, shows him wearing the white crown of Upper Egypt and the red crown of Lower Egypt. It shows him striking down enemies, leading processions, offering tribute to the gods. It is not just a work of art, it is a political message, a declaration that for the first time, Egypt was one. From that unity, the first dynasty was born, and with it, Egypt entered a new age, one of writing, administration, ceremony, and power. The rulers were no longer just strongmen or tribal chiefs. They were kings, and more than that, they were divine. Not gods in theory, but living gods, chosen by the heavens to bring order to the world. The Egyptian word for king, Nesu, meant more than ruler. It meant connection between earth and sky, between people and gods. In the early dynasties, the capital was likely Memphis, near the meeting point of Upper and Lower Egypt. From there, the pharaoh governed the land like a farmer governed his field. He appointed officials. He oversaw irrigation. He directed labor for temples and tombs. But most importantly, he maintained Ma'at, the Egyptian concept of truth, balance, and cosmic order. Ma'at was more than a belief. It was the foundation of everything. The seasons followed Ma'at. The stars moved according to Ma'at. Justice, peace, harvests, health, even the beating of the human heart, all of it was held together by this invisible balance. And the king, as the son of the gods, was responsible for keeping it intact. The people of Egypt accepted this not just out of fear, but out of a deep cultural understanding. The land gave life, but it could also take it. A failed flood meant famine. Disease could sweep through villages without warning. The desert, just beyond the reach of the fields, was a place of danger and death. In a world so finely balanced, the idea of divine rule brought comfort. If the pharaoh was doing his duty, the world would remain whole. And so the people worked. They built temples. They carved stone. They stored grain. They brought offerings. Life was not easy, but it was stable, predictable, connected to something greater. By the time the third dynasty arrived, Egypt had grown into a true state, and under the reign of a man named Djoser, the kingdom would make a leap that would change the landscape forever. Djoser's advisor was a man named Imhotep. He was not a king, not a priest, not a soldier. He was something rarer, a thinker, a designer, a man of ideas. Imhotep is remembered as the architect of the step pyramid at Saqqara, the first monumental stone structure in Egyptian history. Before this, tombs had been simple, mastabas, flat-roofed buildings of mud brick, but Imhotep stacked mastabas one atop another, creating a staircase to the heavens. It was not just a tomb. It was a symbol, a declaration that the pharaoh would not only rule in life, but also in death. The step pyramid was the beginning. After it came more pyramids, larger, sharper, more precise. Each one a monument not just to a man, but to the entire system that made Egypt what it was. A system built on the river, on the calendar, on the people, and on the idea that some lives were eternal. By the end of the Old Kingdom, Egypt had reached a peak that few civilizations had ever touched. It had writing, it had religion, it had administration, and above all, it had continuity. The Nile flooded, the people farmed, the temples prayed, the pharaoh ruled. But time does not stand still. Even the strongest kingdoms face drought, division, and change. What rose beside the river would, in time, stumble. But before that fall, Egypt would give the world something extraordinary. The Great Pyramid. And that story begins next. There are moments in history when ambition meets precision, and the result leaves a mark that endures for thousands of years. In ancient Egypt, that moment came during the reign of a king named Khufu. His name may not be familiar to most, but the monument, built under his rule, is known across the world. It stands not just as a tomb, but as a message carved in stone, a message that whispers across time. It is called the Great Pyramid of Giza. Khufu ruled during the Fourth Dynasty, around 4,500 years ago. His reign marked the height of the Old Kingdom, a period often called the Age of the Pyramids. By this time, Egypt had already been unified for centuries. The power of the pharaoh was absolute. The priesthood was organized. The administration was efficient. The people, though divided by role and class, shared a common belief that the king was the living connection between the gods and the world. To prepare for death was to prepare for eternity. Egyptians did not believe death was the end. It was a passage, a journey, a transformation. The body had to be preserved. The soul had to be guided. And the tomb had to be ready, not just to protect the dead, but to honor them, to elevate them into the divine. For Khufu, this meant building on a scale that no one had ever attempted before. The site chosen was Giza, a plateau west of the Nile. Here, under the watch of the desert sun, workers gathered. They were not slaves, as often imagined, but organized laborers, craftsmen, and engineers. Many were paid in food, clothing, and housing. They came in rotating shifts, working in teams, each responsible for specific parts of the process. Some were quarrymen, cutting limestone from nearby cliffs. Others transported granite from Aswan, hundreds of miles upriver. Some hauled the blocks. Others shaped them with copper tools and polished them to fit with a precision that still astonishes modern engineers. The scale of the task was staggering. The Great Pyramid originally stood at nearly 500 feet tall, with more than 2 million stone blocks. Some weighed more than 50 tons. And yet, the angles are perfect. The base is almost exactly level. The orientation aligns almost precisely with the cardinal points. It is not simply large, it is deliberate. Inside, passageways twist upward and downward, leading to chambers sealed with great slabs of stone. There are no lavish decorations, no gold-covered walls, no elaborate texts. This was a place of purpose, not display. It was meant to protect the king in the afterlife and ensure his rebirth among the stars. Ancient texts suggest that the pharaoh's soul would rise to the heavens and take its place among the gods, particularly among the circumpolar stars, which never set. These were called the imperishables, eternal, unchanging. Around Khufu's pyramid, smaller pyramids were built for queens and family members. Boat pits were dug, with full-sized solar barges buried beside them, meant to carry the pharaoh's soul across the celestial river. Temples were added for rituals and offerings. The complex was alive with purpose. It was not just a grave, it was a spiritual machine, a place where heaven and earth met. Khufu's son, Djedefre, and his successor, Khafre, continued the tradition. Khafre's pyramid, slightly smaller but built on higher ground, appears taller. In front of it sits the Great Sphinx, carved from a single limestone outcrop. It has the body of a lion and the head of a king. Who that king was is still debated. Some say it was Khafre himself. Others suggest it may be older, but its gaze has never wavered. It looks east toward the rising sun, a symbol of renewal and rebirth. These monuments were not built in isolation. They were part of a larger vision. The state mobilized resources, food, labor, and stone in a scale never seen before. Villages near the pyramids housed workers and their families. Granaries, bakeries, breweries, and medical stations supported the workforce. Ostraca shards of pottery have been found with notes and names, schedules and jokes, showing that these workers were not faceless labor. They were real people, living real lives, contributing to something greater. The belief that bound them was not fear, but faith. Faith in the king, faith in the gods, and faith in the order of the world. In Egypt, this order was everything. The concept of ma'at, truth, balance, harmony, ran through every part of life. The Nile flooded on time, the stars returned in their season, and the king maintained the balance. When the system worked, the people thrived. But even as the pyramids rose, change was coming. The cost of such grand constructions was immense. Over time, the strain on resources and the burden on local communities began to show. Later, kings built smaller pyramids, turned to other forms of burial, or moved the capital. The Old Kingdom began to lose its grip. The centralized power that had made such monuments possible started to fracture. By the end of the Sixth Dynasty, internal conflict and drought had weakened the state. The Nile failed to flood regularly. Crops withered. Famine spread. Governors of distant provinces, once loyal administrators, began acting as independent rulers. The court at Memphis struggled to hold authority. The unity that had defined Egypt began to dissolve. This period of decline is now called the First Intermediate Period. It was a time of division, uncertainty, and hardship, but it was not the end. Egypt, like the river that gave it life, would rise again. The idea of Egypt, the eternal kingdom, the land of order, the home of the gods, was too strong to vanish. Still, the Old Kingdom left its mark. The pyramids stood as proof of what was possible. Even in decline, they did not crumble. They watched over the land, silent and enduring. Travelers from faraway lands saw them and marveled. Writers from Greece and Rome would one day call them wonders. And in a way, they are. Not just for their size or mystery, but for what they represent, a civilization that dared to reach for eternity, and for a time, touched it. But the story of ancient Egypt was far from over. New kings would rise, new gods would take the center stage, and the land of the Nile would find its strength once more. The Middle Kingdom awaited, and with it, a new chapter. The land had cracked, but it had not broken. After the fall of the Old Kingdom, Egypt did not vanish. It fractured. Local governors, once loyal to the throne, began to rule their regions like small kingdoms. The central government weakened. Famine and failed floods made life harder. Temples fell into disrepair. Tombs were robbed. And yet, through it all, the people remained. The farmers still planted. The priests still prayed. The Nile still flowed, though not always as generously as before. It was a time of struggle, but not silence. This era, now known as the First Intermediate Period, lasted for over a century. It was a time when the old stories seemed to lose their power, when people questioned whether the gods still watched over them. The Great Pyramids stood in the north, but they were relics now, empty, distant. The kings who once commanded from Memphis had lost their hold. New powers rose in places like Heracleopolis in the north and Thebes in the south. These cities became the centers of rival kingdoms, each claiming to be the rightful heir of Egypt. It was from Thebes that a new dynasty would rise, one that would reunify the land and breathe life back into the kingdom. The man who began that process was Mentuhotep II. He ruled from Thebes, a city far to the south, and after years of slow, careful conquest, he succeeded where others had failed. He brought the two lands back together under a single crown. It was not as sudden or as grand as Narmer's first unification, but it was just as important. From this moment, the Middle Kingdom began. Mentuhotep was not a pyramid builder. His tomb, carved into the cliffs at Deir el-Bahari, was different. It blended architecture with the natural rock, setting a tone that would influence future generations. His reign marked a return to central authority, but it was a softer power, more focused on administration than monument. He reorganized the provinces, appointed loyal officials, and re-established control over trade routes and resources. The temple system was rebuilt. Order returned, slowly but surely. It was during the Middle Kingdom that Egypt became more than a kingdom of kings. It became a land of scribes. Writing flourished. Literature took new forms. One of the most famous texts from this period is called The Story of Sinuhe. It tells of a court official who flees Egypt after the king dies, lives among foreigners, and longs for home. Eventually he returns and is forgiven. The tale is not just a story. It reflects deep themes of loyalty, exile, and identity. It is one of the earliest examples of personal, emotional writing in human history. The Middle Kingdom pharaohs, especially those of the 12th dynasty, were skilled rulers and keen thinkers. One of the most notable was Senusret III. He was both a builder and a warrior. He led campaigns into Nubia, the land to the south, and established fortresses to secure Egypt's southern border. These forts were not just military posts. They were symbols of Egyptian control, complete with temples, administration, and trade. Under Senusret, the border between Egypt and Nubia became both a line of defense and a gateway for culture and commerce. Nubia itself was a land of gold, rich in resources and culture. Though often seen as a frontier, it was more than that. Its people had their own gods, their own traditions. And over time, Egyptian and Nubian cultures blended. Some Nubians served in the Egyptian army. Others traded goods or adopted Egyptian customs. The relationship was complex, sometimes peaceful, sometimes tense, but always important. Back in Egypt, the Middle Kingdom rulers focused on making their government work more smoothly. They relied heavily on trained scribes, who recorded everything from harvests to building projects to court decisions. These men were the quiet backbone of the state. In schools called houses of life, young boys studied for years to master the art of writing. They copied religious texts, legal records, medical knowledge, and poetry. The written word was sacred, a way to preserve truth, to speak to the gods, and to guide the dead. Religion during the Middle Kingdom became more personal. In earlier times, only the king was seen as divine, but now ordinary people began to see themselves as part of the spiritual world. Tombs included texts meant to protect the soul. Statues and stelae often showed not just the deceased, but their families, their prayers, their hopes. The god Osiris, once a minor figure, became central. He was the lord of the underworld, the judge of the dead, the symbol of rebirth. His story of death, resurrection, and justice became a model for all Egyptians. The Middle Kingdom was not a time of great pyramids, but it was a time of stability and richness. The economy grew. Art became more expressive. Jewelry from this period shows incredible skill and beauty, delicate pieces of gold, carnelian, turquoise, and lapis. Statues became more realistic. Faces were carved with care, showing age, wisdom, even sadness. It was as if the Egyptians were beginning to see themselves not just as subjects of a divine king, but as individuals within a larger story. Still, no kingdom lasts forever. By the end of the Middle Kingdom, power began to slip again. Weak rulers followed strong ones. Ambition faded. Foreigners known as the Hyksos began to settle in the delta. At first, they came in peace, traders, craftsmen, families, but over time they grew in number and strength. They brought new weapons, new ideas, and when the central government weakened, they took control. The Hyksos did not destroy Egypt. They ruled parts of it, especially the north, and adopted many Egyptian customs. But to the Egyptians, their presence was a wound. A reminder that order could be broken, that Maat could be shaken. The south, especially Thebes, remained independent, and it was from there that resistance would rise again. The end of the Middle Kingdom led into what is now called the Second Intermediate Period. But once again, this was not the end. It was another turning, another bend in the river. Egypt would rise again, stronger and more determined than ever. The new kingdom was coming, the age of empire, the time of warriors and builders, of queens and conquerors. But even in that bright future, the lessons of the Middle Kingdom would remain the value of order, the strength of writing, and the quiet power of faith. The new kingdom did not begin with triumph. It began with resistance. For nearly a century, Egypt had been fractured. The north was under the control of the Hyksos, foreign rulers who had come from the Levant and settled in the delta. They brought new tools and weapons, including horse-drawn chariots and improved metalwork. Their capital was Avaris, and their influence stretched far. But in the south, the city of Thebes remained free, and in Thebes, a family of determined rulers began to rise. These rulers were not yet great pharaohs. They were local kings, regional leaders fighting to preserve what remained of Egyptian tradition. The most famous of them was Seqenenre-Tao. He died in battle, his skull later found with terrible wounds, likely from Hyksos weapons. His son Kamose continued the fight, pushing northward, attacking Hyksos fortresses. But it was Kamose's brother Ahmose who would finish what they had started. Ahmose was young when he came to the throne, but he was ready. He led a series of campaigns that drove the Hyksos out of Egypt, city by city, stronghold by stronghold. His final victory at Avaris marked more than the end of a war. It marked the beginning of a new era. Egypt was whole again, and this time it would not look inward. It would look out beyond its borders toward the world. The new kingdom was different from what had come before. The old focus on internal harmony, on balance and ritual was still there. But now it was joined by ambition. The kings of this era were warriors and empire builders. They ruled over a powerful, wealthy, and centralized state. They raised armies, sent envoys, collected tribute, and expanded Egyptian control across the Near East and into Nubia. They built temples larger than any ever seen before. Their names were carved into obelisks, tombs, and cliffsides, and some of those names would echo forever. Thutmose III was one of the first great kings of this new age. He was a child when he came to the throne, and his stepmother, Hatshepsut, ruled as regent. But when he took full control, he proved to be a brilliant military leader. Over the course of 17 campaigns, he expanded Egypt's influence deeper into Canaan and Syria than any ruler before him. He kept detailed records of his victories, listing towns, tribute, and spoils. But he was more than a conqueror. He also invested in temples and promoted the worship of Amun, the god who had become the patron of the royal family. Before Thutmose ruled alone, Hatshepsut had already left her mark. Her reign is one of the most remarkable in all of Egyptian history. She was one of the few women to rule as pharaoh, and she did so with strength and style. She wore the traditional symbols of kingship, including the false beard, and referred to herself with male titles in official records. Her most famous monument is her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari, a breathtaking structure of terraces and colonnades built into the cliffs west of Thebes. She launched expeditions to the land of Punt, bringing back incense, gold, and exotic animals. Her rule was peaceful, prosperous, and bold. And for a long time, later rulers tried to erase her memory, but stone remembers. The New Kingdom was also a golden age of art and architecture. Temples were not just places of worship, they were the centers of political, economic, and spiritual life. The Temple of Karnak in Thebes grew into a vast complex with towering pylons, carved columns, sacred lakes, and processional routes. The Temple of Luxor, connected to Karnak by an avenue of sphinxes, was another jewel of the city. These temples were not built in a year or even a lifetime. They were expanded, added to, and rebuilt by generation after generation of kings. In the far south, in Nubia, Egypt built new temples to display its power and secure its resources. One of the most impressive was at Abu Simbel, a masterpiece carved into the rock by Ramses II. 4 colossal statues of the king stare across the desert, guarding the entrance to the temple. Inside, scenes show Ramses in battle, especially the famous Battle of Kadesh, where he faced the Hittites. Though the battle was likely a draw, the walls tell a story of Egyptian glory and divine favor. Ramses ruled for more than 60 years. His reign was long, filled with building projects, campaigns, and political maneuvering. He fathered dozens of children, filled temples with his image, and even moved the capital north to a city called Pi-Ramesses. To his followers, he was a living god. And in time, he would be remembered as the greatest pharaoh of them all. But his greatness was not only in war. He signed one of the first known peace treaties in history with the Hittites, carving it into temple walls in both Egypt and Hatti. It spoke of eternal friendship, mutual support, and the will of the gods to keep peace. But even as Egypt reached these heights, cracks began to form. The wealth of the empire attracted enemies. Sea peoples, mysterious invaders from across the Mediterranean, began to appear on Egypt's shores. Trade routes were threatened. Allied cities in the Levant rebelled or fell. Internally, the power of the priesthood, especially the priests of Amun, began to rival the pharaoh's authority. Taxes increased, resources stretched thin. One king tried to change everything. His name was Akhenaten. He closed the temples of Amun, erased the names of old gods, and built a new city called Akhetaten. He declared that only the sun disk, Aten, was divine. His art was strange and personal. His rule was radical. But when he died, Egypt quickly turned away from his vision. The old gods returned. His successors, including the boy king Tutankhamun, restored the temples, reopened the sanctuaries, and tried to erase the memory of what had been. Tutankhamun is famous now not for what he did, but for what was found. His tomb, discovered in the early 20th century, was nearly intact. Gold, jewels, chariots, and statues filled its chambers. His death mask became a symbol of ancient Egypt around the world. But in his own time, he was a minor figure, a child king who ruled briefly during a time of recovery. As the new kingdom drew to a close, Egypt still stood, but it no longer reached as far or shone as brightly. The treasury was not as full, the army not as strong. The once mighty power that had stretched across empires began to pull inward. The third intermediate period followed, another time of division and foreign influence. But the memory of the new kingdom would never fade. It was a time of greatness, of ambition, of vast temples and towering statues. a time when Egypt looked beyond its own borders and made its mark on the world. And though other ages would follow and other empires would rise, the stories of Hatshepsut, Thutmose, Akhenaten, and Ramses would live on carved into stone, painted on tomb walls, and passed from one generation to the next. They would remind the world that once, on the banks of the Nile, a civilization dared to dream of eternity and came remarkably close. The power that had once shaped an empire was beginning to slip away. After the glory of the new kingdom, Egypt entered a long and uneven descent. It did not fall in a single moment or under a single blow. Instead, it faded slowly, over centuries, through a mix of internal divisions, foreign invasions, shifting alliances, and changes in the world beyond its borders. But even in decline, Egypt remained a land of deep memory and cultural strength. Its temples still stood, its rituals still echoed, and its people still believed in the old ways, even as new powers arrived. As the new kingdom weakened, the priests of Amun in Thebes grew stronger. Their influence rivaled that of the pharaohs. In the north, other rulers claimed authority. Egypt was no longer a unified kingdom. It was a patchwork again, ruled by competing dynasties and local lords. This period is now known as the Third Intermediate Period, and it was marked by fragmentation and uncertainty. Yet even in this time, Egypt was not forgotten. It remained a rich and symbolic place. Its grain fields still fed armies. Its temples still drew pilgrims. Its craftsmen still produced goods valued across the Mediterranean. So when foreign powers looked toward Egypt, they saw both weakness and opportunity. The first great wave of foreign rule came from the west. The Libyans, long neighbors of Egypt, had slowly settled in the delta. Over generations, they had adopted Egyptian customs, language, and beliefs. Some of them rose to power and formed their own dynasties. These Libyan pharaohs ruled parts of Egypt, building temples and maintaining many traditions. But the unity of the land remained broken. Then came the Nubians from the south. Once subjects of Egyptian empire, the Nubians had built their own strong kingdom in the region of Kush. They had adopted many Egyptian ways. Their kings wore pharaonic crowns, built pyramids, and honored Egyptian gods. In time, one of those kings, Paye, marched north and conquered Egypt. His campaign was not only military, it was spiritual. He saw himself as a restorer of the true faith, a protector of the temples and the gods. The Nubian rulers, especially Piye and his successors, brought a brief renaissance. They rebuilt temples, patronized the arts, and emphasized traditional beliefs, but they could not hold Egypt forever. A new power was rising to the northeast Assyria. The Assyrians were fierce warriors, masters of siege and iron. They had conquered much of Mesopotamia and looked westward with ambition. In a series of brutal campaigns, the Assyrians invaded Egypt. They sacked Thebes, tore down statues, and shattered the authority of the Nubian dynasty. The land was left reeling, its cities battered, its unity broken once more. The Assyrians did not stay long, but their presence left a mark. They proved that Egypt, once a power that had reached across the world, could now be invaded and humbled. After the Assyrians, a native Egyptian dynasty rose again in the city of Sais. These kings, particularly Psamtik I and Necho II, tried to revive the strength of the past. They restored temples, strengthened the army, and opened Egypt to foreign trade and influence. Greek mercenaries were hired. Ships sailed farther. The capital shifted, reflecting new priorities. For a time, it seemed Egypt might find a new path forward. But beyond the eastern deserts, history was changing. The Persians, under Cyrus the Great and later Cambyses, expanded their empire to engulf Mesopotamia, Central Asia, and eventually Egypt itself. In 525 before the Common Era, Cambyses conquered Egypt, adding it to the Persian Empire. Egypt became a satrapy, a province ruled by Persian governors. To many Egyptians, this was a bitter pill. Their land, so long a beacon of continuity and pride, was now ruled by foreign kings who spoke different tongues and worshipped different gods. Some Persian rulers tried to respect Egyptian customs. Others did not. Revolts flared up. Temples were desecrated, and yet Egyptian identity endured. The priests continued their rituals. The scribes copied ancient texts. The people prayed as they had always prayed, waiting for a time when native kings might return. That time came briefly. The 28th, 29th, and 30th dynasties brought native rulers back to the throne. These kings tried to rebuild and defend Egypt's independence, but their time was short. In 343 before the Common Era, the Persians returned, harsher than before. Their second occupation was marked by deeper unrest and destruction. And then, everything changed. In 332 before the Common Era, a young Macedonian general crossed into Egypt. His name was Alexander. The Egyptians did not resist him. They welcomed him as a liberator, perhaps even as a pharaoh. He visited the oracle at Siwa, where the priests declared him the son of a god. Alexander founded a new city on the Mediterranean coast. He named it Alexandria. After his death, his empire was divided. Egypt fell into the hands of one of his generals, Ptolemy. And so began the Ptolemaic dynasty Greek rulers in Egyptian land, blending Greek and Egyptian culture in ways both strange and beautiful. The Ptolemies built libraries, temples, and palaces. They spoke Greek, but honored Egyptian gods. They wore Egyptian crowns and followed Egyptian rituals, but their court was Greek in style and language. This period brought new energy, especially in Alexandria, which became one of the greatest cities of the ancient world. Its library, though later lost, was legendary. Its lighthouse, one of the seven wonders, lit the coast for travelers and traders. Scholars came from every corner of the known world to study there. But in the countryside, many Egyptians lived as they always had, farming along the Nile, worshiping at local temples, and holding tightly to traditions that had survived millennia. The last and most famous of the Ptolemies was Cleopatra VII. She was intelligent, politically sharp, and deeply aware of her heritage. She spoke Egyptian, unlike many of her predecessors. She ruled during a time of great pressure as Rome expanded its power across the Mediterranean. Her alliances with Julius Caesar and later with Mark Antony were strategic, born of survival and vision. But her gamble did not succeed. After the Battle of Actium and her death in 30 before the Common Era, Egypt became a Roman province. The temples remained open. The statues still stood. But Egypt was now a part of something larger, ruled from far away. The last pharaoh had fallen. Even so, the memory of Egypt remained. Roman emperors visited and honored the ancient gods. Temples continued to function. Art and architecture carried echoes of the old ways. And when Christianity arrived, it too built on the deep spiritual heritage of the land. For thousands of years, Egypt had been more than a place. It had been an idea of order, eternity, balance, and divine kingship. Even as power shifted, that idea never fully disappeared. The sands covered some of the temples. The language changed. The gods fell silent. But the spirit of ancient Egypt still whispered through the land. In the next and final part of this story, we will return to that spirit, to the people, beliefs, and wonders that still hold the world's imagination, long after the crowns turn to dust. In the end, what remains is not a single king or a single temple. It is a memory carried in stone, in sand, in stories passed from one age to the next. Egypt, more than most civilizations, understood time. It respected the cycles, the rise and fall of power, the return of the floodwaters, the slow journey of the sun across the sky. It built with the patience of people who believed the world would keep turning long after they were gone, and in many ways they were right. Long after the last pharaoh vanished into history, the spirit of Egypt endured. It lived in the temples, in the carvings, in the worn faces of statues whose eyes still seem to follow you. It lived in the Nile, still flowing, still feeding the same land it has shaped for thousands of years. It lived in the stars, where the ancient Egyptians believed the soul would rise and join the imperishable ones, the stars that never set. By the time Egypt became a Roman province, much of what had once made it great had already become memory. But the Egyptians had always prepared for memory. They had written their words in stone, spoken their prayers in rituals meant to echo forever. They had sealed their tombs with spells and songs to guide the soul across the veil of death. They did not believe the end was final. They believed in continuation, in rebirth, in the idea that something lived on, even if the name faded. And their names did fade for a time. The knowledge of how to read hieroglyphs was lost. The temples were buried. The great pyramids stood alone in the desert, seen by travelers but not understood. For nearly 1,500 years, the voices of ancient Egypt were silent. Their stories were locked in symbols no one could read. Their kings became legends. Their gods became shadows. But silence is not the same as absence. In the early 19th century, that silence began to break. A stone was found in the town of Rosetta. It bore a message written in 3 scripts, including ancient Greek. Scholars studied it for years. And then the key was found. A young Frenchman named Jean-François Champollion deciphered the hieroglyphs. He gave the dead their voices back. Suddenly, Egypt spoke again. The temples, tombs, and texts were no longer mute. They told their stories, one inscription at a time. We learned how the Egyptians measured time, recorded harvests, built their cities. We heard the voices of scribes and merchants, of queens and priests, of children who had learned to write their names on broken pots. We read love poems and tax records. We listened to myths that stretched across eternity. Archaeologists uncovered the Valley of the Kings, walked through corridors painted with blue stars and golden gods. They opened tombs sealed for millennia. Some were robbed long ago. Others, like that of Tutankhamun, remained nearly untouched, filled with gold, carvings, and objects of daily life. These were not just treasures. They were memories made solid, held in the hands of the living, crafted for the needs of the dead. Even now we have not uncovered it all. Egypt still holds secrets beneath its sands. Every year, new discoveries add to what we know. A statue buried in a ruined city, a tomb hidden in plain sight, a letter pressed into clay and forgotten. Each piece adds a little more to the story, and the story keeps growing. But what makes Egypt matter most is not just the scale of its monuments or the mystery of its gods. It is something quieter, something older, the way it teaches us about continuity, about devotion, about the human desire to understand the world and to leave something behind. The Egyptians built their world on order, on the belief that everything had its place, that life had rhythm and meaning. They built temples not just to worship, but to anchor the universe. They believed in Ma'at, in balance and truth, and though they lived through war and famine, through invasion and collapse, that belief held firm. They wrote it into law, carved it into stone, lived it in their rituals. That is why Egypt lasted as long as it did. That is why it never truly died. It reached beyond its time. Today we walk through museums and see their work behind glass. We marvel at the perfection of a statue, the detail in a painted wall, the lines of text flowing like water across a tomb. We see the face of a woman who lived 4,000 years ago and still recognize the curve of her cheek, the shape of her hands. We hear the story of a boy king rushed to burial, now known around the world. We stand in front of the pyramids, massive and silent, and wonder how and why they were made. And in those moments, we feel something familiar, not distant, not alien, but human. Egypt was not just about kings and gods, it was about people, farmers who watched the sky for signs of rain, bakers who shaped loaves for offerings, builders who dragged stone through the heat, mothers who prayed for their children, scribes who tried to get the signs just right, all of them part of a world that believed life had meaning, that death was not the end, that memory mattered. That is the gift they left us. In the story of Egypt, we see the outline of our own questions. How do we live well? What should we honor? What lasts after we are gone? The Egyptians answered with stone and stars and silence. And now, through those answers, we remember them. Their kingdoms have crumbled. Their gods no longer walk the earth. Their language took centuries to hear again. But they are not lost. They are with us in our curiosity, in our wonder, in our need to understand who we are and where we come from. This is where the story ends, not in ruin, not in conquest, but in memory. A river still flows through the land they loved. The temples still rise in quiet strength. The names still wait, carved in stone, ready to be spoken once more. And when we speak them, the past lives again.